Okay, so last time we talked about observe. Observe is the first step to develop your own visual language. And it's really important because if you don't really observe, you are just blatantly trying to copy what you see. And without observing and ask yourself the three questions: what primitive was the most distinct feature and what's the value range? If you don't ask yourself those questions, you cannot go on to the next step, which is process. So what is process? Process is when you observe. After you observe, you register that in your brain. After you ask yourself those questions, you start to process that and make that into your own image. Okay, since we are not a camera, we cannot just blatantly try to copy what we see by just painting everything that we see. So process is a very important step. And there are also a few questions that we want to ask ourselves when we process, because you can try to process all you want in your brain, but the thought is not complete without action. So process is usually done kind of while you're painting, a little bit before you're painting. So something that I really want you to understand that is process takes time and experience. Okay, pardon my bad handwriting. I'm not really good handwriter. So process takes time and experience. So when you're just trying to start processing what you see into your own image, this is an ongoing process. No pun intended, but this is an ongoing process. When you see an image, observe, ask yourself that three questions first, and then you're going to process. So as you process while you paint, ask yourself a few questions first. Where does it belong? Okay. Does it belong in foreground, background, or is it a focal point? Okay, and this is mostly scenery we're talking about, because if you're doing portrait or figure, well, your subject is usually the face and the figure, and that's most what you're going to paint. So I'm mostly talking about scenery here. So ask yourself, where does it belong? And the second thing you want to ask yourself is how to make it read with the least amount of information. So how to make it read. How to make it read. And third, what's the process? How many washes do you need? Now this step is more related to watercolor, because if you paint with oil and acrylic or digital, obviously that's going to be different. But since this is a watercolor course, I want to include how many washes. So I have an example here. We have a marula tree, which is a tree from Africa. I just happens to come across this photo. I didn't took that photo, but I think this is a good example to explain the process. Now, last time during observation, I used a building and a car as my example. So a tree is more of an organic shape. So it's a little bit harder to try to break it down into primitive, but I'm going to show you something very interesting a little bit later. But let's think about this question. Where does it belong? Now, if you want to paint trees in the background, okay, let's say we have tree in the background here. Okay, so usually I do like a very loose drawing here. Okay. Let's say this is the background tree. Okay. And then I'll have to think about, okay, so it's a background tree, so it's mostly covered in atmosphere. So even it is green, I want to make it a little bit cooler. So I'll mix it nice, cool green color. And then since it's in the background, most of the time, you don't need a lot of details. So very simple thing. So as you paint, we start to ask yourself second question, how to make it read? Well, this is background, right? So usually background is far in the distance, so there can be a lot of details, especially with the high-res camera that we are taking with a high megapixel count. But since this is background, it's pretty much just a silhouette. So I think this is pretty good for a background. Okay, and then that's 3 trees together, and if it's a group of tree, we combine those shapes and maybe add a little bit more tree trunk here, and then we have a group of trees. That's for the background. Okay, if it's background, keep it simple. Keep it loose. Can add a little bit of color, but let it remain to be a single group of shape. So what do you need to make it read? Not all the leaves, but a little delicate detail like this. Okay, the silhouettes of leaves, a group of leaves, and then the trunk, the tree trunk. Okay, that's all you really need if the tree is in the background. Okay, so what about if the tree is in the middle ground? Well, if tree is in the middle ground, then most likely it's gonna be part of the focal point, and then we need a little bit more detail. So we're gonna start that with drawing as well. So still, I'm not going to do like a super detailed drawing. Okay, because again, we are trying to do a loose painting. So whenever I draw a tree, well, since it's organic shape, you don't have to stress yourself out to make it super accurate. But do observe as you draw how the tree trunk grows and try to make it organic. What's distinct about this tree is the tree really spread out, the branch really spreads out, so that's something that we want to make sure that we get in. So we have our branch and our tree trunk, and let's do the leaf. Now, the leaf, we're not going to paint every single leaf into like crazy millions of dots. We're simply going to treat leaf as a group. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick. Well, it's not really a trick, it's just a different way of seeing things. So, this is an organic shape. So it's hard to kind of break it down into primitive, right? But there's a few things that we still can reference from. So if we try to break this down into a primitive, well, the tree trunk, although it's bending, is a little bit of shape and such, is still essentially a cylinder. Okay? Still essentially a cylinder. And on top of that cylinder, well, there's some more cylinders. If this cylinder doesn't bend, doesn't grow organically, there's still just a bunch of cylinders connect with each other. And the leaves, well, the leaves, as I already mentioned, I grouped them together into group. So what if we pretend all the leaves are just a bunch of spheres together? Now what's going to happen is, because our light is coming from, so a little bit from the front and the left, okay? So our sun is sort of going to that direction from here. So if we think of those groups as a bunch of little spheres, they connect to each other, and we try to shade those spheres. Now, if you go back to the primitive, the lighting from the fundamental, you are going to be really familiar with how the lighting on the sphere works. Okay, so I'm just really roughly shade those in. So we have the light on this side, and each of the sphere is having shadows. So if we paint this funny little thing, this is what's going to happen. Yeah, I'm going to paint this tree trunk first. And since the light is coming from the left, it's going to be darker on the right. I'm going to exaggerate the value a little bit just so you can see. I mean, even in the photo, the tree trunk is actually all dark. But I just want to help you to read that shape. So we have our light area and our shadow area on the right, right? That's as simple as we can do. Okay. And then let's pretend some of the branch is showing up, like so, maybe a little bit here. But let's focus on our leaves here, our spherical looking leaves. So if we do this, we just simply do that. Let's just paint in all the shadow area. Okay. And then let's say this sphere is on the bottom, so it's getting the cast shadow from the other sphere. So let's just paint it all dark. So this one, and then we have all this sphere like so. And then since the sun is pretty warm, can add a little bit of yellow in our light area. I'm just gonna roughly paint that in while it is still wet, so it all kind of blends in. And we have our darker shadow. Seeing that leaf. Okay, I treat all those like group of spheres. And look at that, we have a funny looking tree, but you can kind of get an idea. Okay, so this value, that light, when you are group them all together, that gives this thingy value. Okay. So let's work on this tree for real. Now, looking at the photo, the tree trunk is all really dark. That's because it's under all these trees, you know, and if we need to look at this tree three-dimensionally. So the tree doesn't only go sideways, it also goes front and the back. So it's kind of like an umbrella. It's giving a overall shadow of this tree. So that's why the tree trunk is pretty dark. So we go back to the observation. What's the value range? Well, the value range varies from, I would say, mid-tone to dark. So let's start with the tree trunk here. Okay, can make it even darker if we want to. So this is the middle ground tree, and also happens to be our focal point, let's say. Okay. Of course, in a real painting, you usually have a background painted out first, and then you start to paint this since it's darker. Okay. And then we also need to think about how to make a wreath. So the group of leaf, we still have that. A tree trunk, we still have that. Now, this another thing that we need to think about is, well, the delicate shape of the branch. So I am actually going to use a brush that's a little bit smaller for this work. And then how many washes do we need? So I think the goal is always to use as few as possible, but sometimes that's not always feasible. So let's say maybe we'll use 2 washes for this tree. Okay. So the tree trunk, and then we have the branch branching out. I have a little bit branching out here. We'll look at our reference, seeing what branch is showing the most. I think it's this large branch that's showing quite a bit, so make it a little bit darker. Okay. And I skip a little bit so they can have some trees, leaves overlapping. And this one also is showing quite a bit. Okay, and the rest of it, I think I'll just skip it for later, and that's do the group of leaves. Now, we are not painting every single leaf. Okay, that's not how the loose painting work. Instead, group them together. Okay, group. Grouping is one of the very important things for visual language. You want to group your shape together so they look pretty good. Now, let's say we need 2 layers for that. I mean, I think I can do 1 layer, but just for safety's sake, let's do 2 layers. And we have ourselves, let me see, let me mix a green color. Let me do a test here. Oh, that looks pretty good. We can make it a little bit warmer by adding some yellow ochre. And then again, okay, the leaves. You know, we can have some little delicate brush for the leaves, like so. Okay. Little delicate brush stroke, like that. Okay. So what's the distinct feature of this tree? Well, how the branching out like that to make it looks almost like a huge umbrella mushroom kind of shape. And also all the tree makes this interesting irregular silhouette. And the key to loose painting is trying to articulate what you see in the simplest manner. So how to make it read with least amount of information. This is how. Give it a few dots so it feels like there's a lot of things. A few dots here and there, and then you see this large shape like that. Your brain is going to tell you that, okay, yeah, this is a combination, a huge sum of these little shapes, which is leaves. Okay. So, let me try to paint just a little bit faster. Okay. I want to make it a little bit even warmer here. So, yep. Okay, so How many wash do I need? I'll say 2 right now. Leave some white, okay? Now, I'm not copying what I see, but I do try to capture the essence because of this white that tells you that, okay, there's leaves, some place has more leaves, some place has less leaf. That's why you start see the background, you start see the white. Okay? And we have a little group of leaf right here. Okay? If we take this idea that all this group of trees are just a bunch of spheres, then we can take that idea and start to paint this a darker, maybe a little bit cooler color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start giving all these leaves some volume, like so. Okay, some dark down here, a little bit more dark down here, because like these cylinders is getting more shadow from the other leaves and branches. And we have some shadows here, a little bit shadow here. Okay, another thing is don't be so repetitive. Okay, if you have the idea that the light is coming from here, so the tree leaves are receiving light, if you think about it, you are already well on your way to have a nice looking tree. Okay, so this part is mostly in shadow. Okay. Then mix a little bit cooler color, a little bit alizarin, a little bit more cobalt. Just drop those color in. So I do this wet and wet because I want some soft edge. So it feels like sphere, that there's a soft transition from light to dark. And this is why I do this wet onto wet. Okay. And try to think about where to paint with least amount of brushstroke. You can do some short stroke, but keep dabbing into it. Okay, almost done. I think I'll have a few more. Do a few more dry brushing here and there, just give it a little bit more texture. And that's the fun of the watercolor, I can splash some water on it. By splash some water on it, it gives a little bit texture, breaks all the consistency of the marks that I made. So if you look at this two, what are the difference? Well, this is only more sophisticated than this. Now this is wet, so when we talk about how many washes do I need, well, I want to have at least another wash on top, which is another layer on top. So what do? I want some sharper edges for the branches. So if you really think about it and plan it, I will need to wait for this to be completely dry in order to have some hard edges. So I'm going to wait for this to dry. Okay, so now that this is dry, I can do another layer. So I'm going to mix a nice dark color, and I'm going to use my trusty dagger rosemary brush so that it can help me with some delicate mark. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to, look at the reference. There are actually some tree branches kind of go in and out of this. Okay, if you think about these things three-dimensionally, there are some tree leaves that's in front of the branches and some leaves are on the back of the leaf. So I'm going to, let's say here we have some leaves, some branches. So here we have some branches, breaking them apart. Okay, and here definitely has a strong branch here. We can even try to maybe re-wet some of the area randomly. And then go back to it. So what that does is some of the branch shape will be softer as we paint. Okay. Go back. I want to make this a little bit softer. So, okay. Okay, so when I break those branches, those are the distinct feature of this tree. That's what makes it more dimensional, because it starts to feel like some of the branches are behind, some of the branches are in the front. That's how you can kind of give the illusion that, okay, there's a bunch of leaves there. Okay, so is this guy. Now it feels like this weird sort of lollipop with a bunch of sphere, but the moment I start to give it some branches going in and out, all of a sudden it looks more like a tree here. Okay. Feels like some of the branch is poking out of the sphere, while some leaves, while some branches are inside the sphere. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much for the tree. Now, what if it is foreground? Usually, if it is foreground, we don't see the whole tree, because the foreground, let's say this is your painting. If it's the foreground, it's usually used to frame the painting in a certain way. So let's say maybe we see a little bit branch here, we see a little bit of tree trunk here, but mostly it's the branch. And we have our tree leaves here. And in this case, we actually see a little bit more of individual leaves. Okay, so that's our foreground tree. And because of the composition, the darker the thing is, the more forward it looks. So in this case, if the tree is a foreground element that frames the painting, we need to make it as simple as possible. So if you have a lot of contrast like this, it's going to grab your viewer's eyes. So we simply just want to frame this painting. That's the role of this tree right here. So I'm going to actually just paint the silhouette. So I'll go back to my Kolinsky brush. I'll mix a nice dark value here, and I'm just going to really organically paint out this tree. This part is almost like a Chinese, Japanese calligraphy painting. So what we really need to focus on was the distinct feature about this tree in the foreground is the delicate silhouette, is the delicate tree branch, how it beautifully frame the painting like so. And then it have leaves as well, so. But because this is in the foreground, we'll make them darker. So a lot darker than this. For the purpose of composition, not because it's actually darker, it doesn't get any sun. It does, but because it's in the foreground, the role of this tree is to frame. So we just give it some really dark silhouette. And again, at this scale, we see a little bit more detail. So we actually paint a little bit more smaller shape, relatively small. Okay. To give a sense of detail. Now I'm using a rough paper, and if you make sure it's relatively dry, you get some dry mark, which is perfect for foliage like this. And that's it. That's your foreground tree. Okay, so if you look at this tree, they are all trees. They are actually the same trees. This is a group of this tree, and this tree is standing alone in the midground. And this tree, now if we move this tree to the foreground like so, they're playing different roles in your painting. So where does it belong also means what's the role of this element. Okay, whether it's car, tree, building, animal, people, whatever it is, what's the role is playing in your painting. So if it is a middle ground, it has more detail, doesn't mean that we start to drawing in the painting individual leaves. Okay, and how many washes? Again, 2 washes, but if it's a foreground, 1, and just mix your paint a lot thicker and darker. And so does the background. We need to make it lighter. So again, just 1 wash. So this also, while you're processing, this also have a lot to do with observation. So that's why when we go over observe, we also do a little bit of process. So observe and process. Observe and process. They are tightly connected together. You can't really observe without process, and you can't really process anything if you don't observe. So when you observe, you ask yourself that question. That's 3 questions. In this tree, we can tell what's the primitive. Like I already showed you, cylinder and spheres. So that's the primitive. And what's the most distinct feature? Well, the tree branches, the organicness of the silhouette, and the lush feeling of the leaves. And the third thing was the value range. And then that depends on where does it belong. If it's a background, it's pretty light value. If it's a middle ground, the value range is more from mid-tone to a dark tone. And if it's in the foreground, it's mostly dark. So after you observe, we start to think about, well, how do I make it read? How many brush strokes should I need? How simple the brush stroke should be. Use as least amount of information to make it read. And how many washes do I need? So I hope this example helps you to understand how do I process the image. And usually that's done while you're painting, or a little bit before you're painting. So while you're planning for your painting, you also process what you see. What role does this play in your painting? If you treat everything the same, if you treat everything as a middle ground tree, even the background tree, you still try to give a certain amount of detail, you lose that distance. If I cover that, you can actually kind of see that, oh, that feels like a background and this feels like middle ground. So if you treat everything the same, you'll lose the depths. So when you process, think about where does it belong? How do you make it read? And how many washes do you need? This is really important because this helps you to plan your painting. And how many washes? If you require more than one wash, then maybe the first wash you'll do that while on your second wash, and then when your whole second wash, this and other stuff is done, it's dry, you made a third wash, which is the third layer, so you can paint your dark here, and then maybe if some animals on top of grass or something, you can paint those. So these are very important questions to ask yourself. But definitely, once again, the importance of fundamental. The importance of fundamentals. This is really important if you want to make a convincing painting. You need to understand how lighting work on primitive, and you will need to able to break it down. Even something as organic as a tree, you can still break it down into primitives and think about the basic lighting. How does the lighting going to work on this tree? So with that said, I'm going to paint some shadows for these trees. So the shadow is the same thing. See, I break the shape a little bit so it feels like they're a bunch of leaves. And here we have the tree. Now full on with cast shadow and everything. Alright, I hope this is helpful for you. Again, ask yourself the question and keep practicing, keep trying out this process. And the more you do it, the more you think about it, the more developed your visual language is going to get, and you'll be able to paint a nice loose painting.